Good evening, friends. The lights are magically glowing. That's so nice. Thank you for braving Maine's ever-changing precipitation patterns and joining us in Hannaford Hall tonight as we welcome Dr. J.T. Roane of Rutgers University here to USM. I think I literally know all of you, but but my name is Libby Bischoff, and I'm the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education here at USM. And it's really a pleasure to welcome you to our annual Mattson-New York Times lecture, this year entitled Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life, and the Politics of Place. So Dr. Roane is gonna talk for about 45 minutes. We'll have a nice little Q&A at the end. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about why we have this particular lecture, because it's kind of an interesting and very much a USM story. So the Mattson-New York Times lecture is made possible by an endowed lecture fund that was established in 1994 by the New York Times Company Foundation and an anonymous donor. And it was in honor of Walter E. Mattson, who was the former president and chief operating officer of the New York Times. And you're like, so why does a map library at USM have a lecture named after the former COO of the New York Times? Let me tell you. So when Walter Mattson passed away in 2016, and this, the fund was established when he retired, but he was a 1949 graduate of Deering High School. He served in the Marine Corps, and he got his degree at Portland Junior College, and then Portland University, which were the Portland campus's predecessor institutions at USM. Like so many of our 21st century students, Mr. Mattson, a veteran, worked his way through his entire undergraduate education. He was a printer at the Portland Press Herald at night and a student by day. He continued in the newspaper business, obviously, after graduation, in advertising and printing and production up and down the East Coast. He went and got another degree in electrical engineering. And in 1960, he started working at the New York Times. He was the assistant production manager when he started, and when he ended, he was the president and chief operating officer. Those careers aren't as possible in today's world as they were in the 1960s, but he worked the press, and then he ran it. And so when he retired, this lecture was founded in his honor at his alma mater. And I always feel like his legacy is really just a tremendous example of what like a really solid work ethic combined with a USM education can accomplish. So we're very grateful for this lecture fund to allow us to bring really wonderful nationally renowned speakers like Dr. Roane to share their work and their knowledge with our communities. Before I introduce JT, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement for Mattson-New, which is the truest name, actually, in Maliseet poet Miku Paul's words, of the now called city of Portland, Maine, where here at Hannaford Hall, and certainly us at the Osher Map Library, sit. We sit on land that was once water, once part of a water-based ecosystem, which for thousands of years before the French and English set foot on the neck, provided for the indigenous peoples of the Dawnland, the Wabanaki, and those who were here from the beginning in kinship with the land and the water. And we acknowledge this truth at the same time as we acknowledge the contemporary presence of the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq, and Maliseet peoples, and as we acknowledge the devastation of settler colonialism past and present. And it's really, for us, this is really important. I mean, as a map library, we talk about place, we think about place. We are deeply in and of these places we were in and occupy today. And so acknowledging that, although just a first step, is an important part of this work. So it's a true pleasure to introduce this evening's featured guest. Dr. J.T. Roane is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Geography in the Andrew W. Mellon Chair in the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University in New Jersey. He's not quite there right now or yet, because he is a 2022-23 Social Science Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study. And he is currently at work on an experimental short film titled Plot, with support from the Crossroads Project at Princeton. Dark Agoras, which came out in January with NYU, is his first book. And so we were able to distribute about 100 copies of Dark Agoras. Many of you have gotten them, to faculty, staff, students, and community members. JT has been super generous with his time. Willie's been on campus this week, meeting with students, making use of our archives at the MAP library, and now delivering this public lecture, which we're also recording tonight, so you'll be able to share it with others. And I just want to add that I really deeply value JT as a colleague for a great number of reasons. We met this summer at a 3-week institute that we were both at in DC. And I really value his humor, his essential kindness, his deep curiosity, his love for all things archival, which we share, and quite honestly, his brilliance, which you will get to know a little bit tonight. He's one of my favorite people to talk to. So USM is the better for him having been here this week. And now I'm going to pass the mic. Please help me warmly welcome JT to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Libby. And thank all of the faculty and staff organizers, as well as the tech folks. Really appreciate this. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Talking with students, as Libby mentioned, and also just doing the kind of archival stuff. I'm definitely a map and geography nerd, so it's been really quite nice. I'm gonna jump in, and so primarily I'll be talking from the first portion of the book, most substantively, and then I'll give a deeper sense of how it connects, or a sort of a sense of how it connects to the other portions of the work as I go forward. So Dark Agoras really does focus in on the ways that Black communities, in the context of plantation enclosures, in the context of slavery, created alternative practices of place, and in the context of plantations, and the ways that those evolved in the post-emancipation period, and then how they're grafted through the Great Migrations into the urban context, and particularly into Philadelphia. So I'll just jump in. I want to, and really, again, because the sort of first portion of this book really does center Southern communities, and particularly in the Tidewater, Virginia, as I'll talk about more. I want to talk from the kind of frame of plotting the Black Commons, and hopefully it'll be clear what I mean by this as we move forward. So I want to start actually with thinking about film. This is a portion, or one of the layers from the plot film that you mentioned. So this is shot in collaboration with the dancer here, Johnny Cruz Mercer. And this footage is gathered for a plot that evolved out of the work for the beginning of this book manuscript, and which helps to show where this work comes out of for me. I'm born and raised in Essex County in Virginia, in the Tidewater, and I continue to return to that place for family, to honor my dead loved ones, including my father who was buried there. And I look to it, of course, with an abiding interest in its well-being and possibilities for the future. So this film project that this draws from uses visual and sonic palimpsest, or layering, to draw out the myriad meanings and uses of historic rural Black landscapes in the expression of intra and interregional, familial, and collective identities. The use of layering of visuals and eventually sound. I'm working with a composer, James Dargan. Ask viewers this whole experience, visual and the sonic, ask viewers to be immersed, to linger in the past and the present of these sites, to be haunted by them in their totality as well as their ephemerality. This footage, which takes only a small place in plot, calls attention to the edges of a plantation near the presently dammed headwaters of Mount Landing Creek, in an area that was once navigable by flatboat and platted in the 1650s as part of the original, in scare quotes, legal Anglo settlement of Rappahannock territory south of the eponymously named river. Beyond its service and plot, I use it as part of other work that helps to recover formulations of place, identity, collectivity, and belonging, codified as part of the implicitly illicit, at the edges of the landscapes of dominion, marking an insurgent spatial claim of autonomy and collectivity in relation to other people, but also in relation to the dynamic ecotone of the tidewater. Mercer uses his body here as a form of poetry, and I read it as subtly invoking the insurgent in the sense that Catherine Benjamin Golden describes insurgent ecologies in her description of the Great Dismal Swamp as the kind of spaces at the edges of the plantation landscape used by the enslaved for the generation and regeneration of vitality. And vitality here, not in the biopolitical sense of slave medicine or health for future exploitation and prolonged living and death, but in the sense of a bottom-up generated force, forwarding practices, and a horizon beyond enclosure, extraction, disposability, and ecocide. What I really, in focusing on this visual work, hone in on the question of what happens if we turn our attention to these types of spaces at the ecological and social margins, and in relation to a transitory Black commons, as sites for reclaiming Black place in Virginia, and as we'll see in a dynamic, in a regional connection between this part of Virginia and Philadelphia. So, and I should note that this is at the headwaters of the creek that I mentioned, Mount Landing, and the plantation is called Mahogany, quite terrifyingly named for a vanquished indigenous nation, as well as, of course, being a plantation where hundreds of people were enslaved from the 1650s through the 1860s. It's anathema really to move on from film while it's still running, but in the interest of time, I want to get into the kind of meat of my talk. I want to start actually with, and he was about to end, so that was well timed. I want to start with my own home community and thinking about hog stealing. And so let me just set the kind of conditions for this first, to say that the backdrop of this, of course, is the reality that starvation is used in the context of plantation ecologies and economies as a mode of discipline. And that's not the use of glut and feasting is not outside of that economy of violence, I should note as well. So in Virginia, for example, in the antebellum period, as many enslaved folks and masters note in their own documentation, feasting is often used, again, to punctuate violence. And what I mean by that, for example, in Virginia, is that, for example, during the Christmas holiday, enslaved folks who on a regular basis don't receive enough nutritional intake, both calorically or in terms of vitamins and nutrients, are basically stuffed around Christmas, right? They have an overabundance of food. They're often plied with liquor, even forced to drink liquor in this context. And yet, we might be tempted to view that as outside of the discipline of starvation that is used by masters in this context. And yet, we know from the calendar of Virginia and the sale calendar in Virginia that that's not the case. So about a week after Christmas is on January 1st is the major rental and sell-off day that, so that big feast on Christmas is followed a week after by the likelihood that many of your loved ones you'll never see again, right? Or you may not see for extended periods of time. So another contextualization of this very quickly before I jump into these materials is the reality that in Virginia, many English and other observers in the colonial period and into the antebellum period note that hogs and cattle actually run fallow. So the idea that you're hog stealing, as I'll talk about in a second, is interesting given that these hogs are actually literally running around in the woods and have replaced the kind of indigenous flora and fauna in many contexts, in this context in Virginia. And of course, as J.B. Jackson and other landscape historians note, for example, the first uses of the word cowboy are actually for young enslaved boys in Maryland and Virginia who go out into the woods and wrangle cattle and feral hogs and all of that. So with all of that kind of context, I want to focus in here on what are repressive, violent inflictions against Black communities who engage in what's labeled hog stealing in this context. So and this is my home county in Virginia, Essex. We have Harry and Will, as well as Flora and Tom, who both pairs received more than 39 lashes in the context of the public pillory for so-called hog stealing. Of course, the second offense for so-called hog stealing is having your ears nailed to the pillory, and the third offense comes with having your ears removed. And so, of course, these records that I'm drawing on for this are repressive records that only document Black life as it's being squelched, right? Black social worlds as they're being squelched. But what's of interest to me is still the kind of social worlds that precede this violent record, where these communities are engaged in what's technically a kind of stealing, but are using that to create social life and a social existence at the edges of plantation life. I'm going to move on into thinking about these records that I'm going to draw on here now are primarily from the antebellum periods or taken in the 20th century, but refer back to the antebellum period. So Elizabeth Sparks is quoted as saying, sometimes they beat them so bad, they just couldn't stand it, and they would run away to the woods. If you get in the woods, they couldn't get you. You would hide, and people would slip you something to eat. Once in a while, there was free Negroes who came from somewhere. They could come see you if they were your folks. Negroes used to go way off in the quarters and slip and have meetings. They called it stealing the meeting. So quite literally in this context, Black communities understand that their social existence is marked as a theft and criminal, and they literally call it stealing the meeting. I also want to highlight here the ways that Sparks notes how this relation that I think precedes and exceeds direct confrontation with plantation power, when she says that you could hide and people slip you something to eat. That is, I think, so often in the historiography of enslaved life and even post-emancipation life, this kind of radical care work has been diminished in terms of its radicalness, to be quite frank, in the interest of centering marronage, the runaway Maroons, or centering those who have direct confrontation, like Nat Turner with the slaveocracy. And yet we see here that in this context, slipping somebody something to eat is equally as dangerous, right? Actually, if you're caught, you might also be whipped to within an inch of your life or have your life taken. And I think what that helps us to recenter is the ways that Black women, children, elders, and others are actually the generative source of rebellion, even if they're not often marked in that way, and I think that's quite critical. I'm going to move to Charles Crowley. When slaves ran away, they were brought back to their masters and misses. When they couldn't catch them, they didn't bother, but let them go. Sometimes the slaves would go up and live at other places. Some of them lived in the woods off of taking things such as hogs, corn, and vegetables from other folks' farms. Well, if these slaves was caught, they were sold by their new masters to go down south. They tell me the masters down south were so mean to slaves, they would let them work them cotton fields till they fall dead with holes in their hands and would beat them. I'll come back to this point about the spreading of the cotton plantation and the plantation as a form and its ecocidal sort of trajectory in a moment when I get later into the talk. But I want to just note here, first of all, again, the relation of what's considered theft, hogs, corn, and vegetables from other folks' farms, but also, as we'll see, or as we started to see, this kind of people slipping you something to eat as part of that tradition, so it may not always be a direct kind of theft. And also, I want to just highlight here folks going up and taking and living at other places, which is another dynamic part of the Black geographies that these communities create in the interstices or at the edges or in other relations that are not centered in our accounting of plantation enclosure geographies, but that are critical, right? In part because if you've read Harriet Jacobs' narrative, for example, Harriet Jacobs recalls that the way that her uncle built a garret or a small like attic-like space into her grandmother's cabin. And of course she uses that to hide from her master for 7 whole years in order to plot her eventual successful self-liberation through running away from Edenton, North Carolina to New York and further. But what's critical here is that those folks who are taking those runaways into these spaces are equally as vulnerable to violence and all of that in this context. But we get a sense of the ways, again, that the kind of official mapping, the official documentation of geographies on the part of masters have no kind of real no bearing on how enslaved folks encounter and use and create alternative geographies within this space. And also just taking up to the woods and living out in the woods. Like they have a whole intimate knowledge of forests and the places between plantations in this part of Virginia, especially swamps and other sites that as Benjamin's work, Benjamin Golden's work, who I mentioned before, talks about in relation to the Great Dismal Swamp, and others who have done archaeological work point to in that area specifically. There are thousands of people who live in the swamp up to the end of the Civil War, right? If you know anything about the Great Dismal Swamp, it's like this much land and that much water, right? So a tenuous and not a romantic version of living outdoors, but certainly one that requires a certain intimacy, a knowledge of plant life, a knowledge of all sorts of flora and fauna, again, that exceed the kind of rubric of Black life as just either static and placed in confinement or shifted around at the will of masters for sale, etc. James L. Smith, in a self-published narrative from 1880, notes, "One night I went crabbing and was up most of all night. A boy accompanied me. We caught a large mess of crabs and took them home with us. The next day I had to carve for the women to spin, and being up all night, I could hardly keep my eyes open. Every once in a while I would fall asleep." So of course, this downloading of responsibility in the context of slavery to feed yourself is actually a double tax, right? So you work all day, and then at night you have to, you garden by moonlight or fish or hunt or other things outside of the kind of time of direct productive labor, and yet we see, despite that being a downloaded kind of responsibility, that these communities use it to create social life, and social life that tugs at the kind of the logics of plantation discipline. Like literally, I don't think masters have in mind like going out with your friends all night and playing and going crabbing when they download this kind of responsibility onto the enslaved. They don't have that in mind, and certainly they don't have in mind where you do it to the degree that you can't do your work the next day, right? So we get a sense of the ways that, again, this kind of downloaded responsibility, saying that enslaved folks can have the trash land, you can grow your own food, we don't feed you enough, like that actually allows Black communities to create alternative values outside of land as commodity and water as either transport or also commodifiable, that it gives an alternative ethos in this context. James V. Dean, 1937 WPA narrative from Maryland. "My choice food was fish and crabs cooked in styles by my mother." Even in his narrative, this is a kind of passing moment in the narrative. But what's critical, of course, is if you've read Frederick Douglass's narrative, you know that in this context, for example, Frederick Douglass notes that he only saw his mother 3 to 5 times and by way of night in this context in Maryland. And Douglass, of course, notes in his narrative that the reason for this in the Upper South, like Maryland and Virginia and the Tidewater, is largely to prepare young enslaved people for sale into the Deep South. It stripping young people of these very basic bonds and connection to their mothers or their fathers or other siblings or family allows, at least from the advantage of masters, allows and facilitates their future sale into the Deep South. So actually having this memory of something that your mother cooked in this context, and having that as a kind of insurgent memory that his mother probably very, very intentionally instilled with him without a guarantee that they would be connected for the rest of his life, right? And also, again, the ways that these Black social worlds integrate and are entangled with knowledges about fishing, fish species, crabs, and all of that is really interesting to me, again, because of my kind of abiding interest in Black geographies, Black ecologies, and the kinds of knowledges that underwrite them. So in this context, I want to, get to the full insurgent text that is Many Folks' narrative, also from 37. This is taken at Petersburg, Virginia. And before I read it, I just want us to ponder that probably an 80-something-year-old Black woman living in the Jim Crow South is saying this. Like, before I read it, just keep that in mind, that this is someone who lives in a context in which she could still literally be killed at the whim of most white folks, right? So she describes how slaves used a great big iron pot at the door to dampen the sounds of their worship and to prevent capture by the old paddy rollers or slave catchers, who, quote, would come and horsewhip every last one of them just because those poor souls were praying to God to free them from that awful bondage. Folks also recalled the worshipers, quote, tying grapevines and other vines across the road. Then when the paddy rollers came galanting with their horses, running so fast you see them vines would tangle them up and cause the horses to stumble and fall. And lots of times badly they would break their legs and the horses too. One old poor devil got tangled up and the horse kept carrying him till he fell off the horse. And the next day that sucker was found in the road with them vines was wound around his neck so many times. It had choked him, they said. He was totally dead. Serves him right because them old white folks treated us so mean. A number of things here. First of all, I'm interested in the kind of plant knowledges that are required and also weaponized here to know, well, of course, grapevines, but also to know what other kind of vines are sturdy enough to catch a horse's leg and to trip them. Like, that requires a certain knowledge and intimacy with forests and with plant life. And as I talk maybe about, and potentially in Q&A, if it comes up, enslaved folks and post-emancipation Black communities have all kinds of categories for understanding useful plants and all of that have been lost, primarily because in the postbellum period they're associated with old plantation life and considered backwards and not meaningful. But that's a whole there are whole Black taxonomies of plant life that are required. I also want to say that in some relationship perhaps to kind of posthumanism, that here, I guess starting from the vantage of enslaved communities and Black communities in general, the kind of flattening and sometimes generative and productive engagement between, I guess, demystifying or downplaying the kind of boundaries that happen between human and non-human life here really have to deal with the fact that horses, dogs, and other kinds of animals are weaponized against Black communities. That's a critical, I think, part of that discussion that outside of people like Zakiya Jackson's Becoming Human and others really kind of ignore that in the kind of genealogy as they move into posthumanism, but I think is a critical one. The use of great big iron pots at the door, in other slave narratives, the use of wet blankets around hush arbors, those are critical counter-surveillance technologies that are essential for the ways in which Black communities take to the quarters, take to the woods to practice their kind of social worlds. And I also, just before moving on, I want to note here that folks said straight up, like, yes, we were out there praying to God, but it wasn't some far off, distant heaven that they were praying for. They were like, God, come free us right here, right now, right? And I think that's important to know because I think Afro-Christianity, Black Christianities are often understood as a kind of palliative or a placating kind of formation with certain conservative threads. And I think here we understand that the hush arbor is a space in which Black communities are actually literally praying for their immediate liberation. Again, not some far off heaven. So I want to just think with you very quickly using other folks' maps from the Creating the American South digital resource at the University of Richmond to just give the context in which the Black communities in this, in the Tidewater and other parts of the Upper South are being translocated, moved into the Deep South as a part of the kind of ecocidal evolution of plantation ecologies. And so here we have Black population change from 1800 to 1810. The lightest blue dots represent the highest population loss. The lightest tan dots represent the highest population gain. You can see that already by 1810 to 1820, 1800 to 1810, that you have the dislocation of enslaved populations along the kind of Tidewater and the coastal Carolinas into the Piedmont region and into Louisiana. This from 1820 to 1830 shows the intensification of that and the kind of emergence of the Cotton Belt. And this is Choctaw, Cherokee, Caddo, and other land that's being rapidly transformed from the kind of integrated forest and cultivation practices of those indigenous nations into a monocultural, ecocidal, what really we should understand as ecocidal monoculture cotton plantations. And here we could see, so when you see those narratives that were taken in the 20th century with folks who were young in the antebellum period, you see why they emphasize the ways that their communities they could be sold at any moment for any infraction, perceived or real, against their masters, and why that, this idea that that Black communities go and are sold down there to die in cotton fields really puts pointedly ecocide and anti-Blackness together in one fold, which I think is critical. But here we see the massive, from the Tidewater region, as well as from coastal Carolina, as well as already parts of the Cotton Belt are undermining the soil to such a degree that they're also being moved. So we see the kind of, again, the ecological, ecocidal, and anti-Black development of the plantation in this context, which helps to explain why these communities have these sorts of experiences in this period. And this is just a map, again, from the same resource that gives you the intensive cotton production. And of course, the bright red in the middle of the kind of along the Mississippi, around Natchez and all of that, as well as around Montgomery, is about 45 bales of cotton per square mile. So you get a sense of how what had been forested land is rapidly converted through the genocidal displacement of indigenous nations, as well as the massive enslavement of Africans and their descendants in this context into, the kind of rapid deterioration of the environment in this context. And yet we see in the Deep South narratives of enslaved folks that the forms of plotting in this context, meaning the kind of grounded relations that come with this kind of connection to the earth that's alternative, how they continue to kind of shape Black life and social worlds in the context of these displaced communities. So Donneville-Broussard in the Deep South, each slave could have their own little garden. They raised vegetables and had a couple of beehives for the honey. Again, could have the little garden suggest that masters are like, oh yeah, take the trash land and feed yourself. But we've already seen the ways that this is part of an insurgent geography, or used as part of an insurgent geography, because people are feeding runaways are feeding themselves. All these kinds of relations continue in this context. And I just end this portion in this portion that focuses in on slavery by thinking about Charlotte Brooks, whose 1890 narrative taken by Octavia V. Rogers Albert in Louisiana is critical. This is a critical narrative. First of all, the WPA didn't have any Louisiana narratives, so this gives critical insight about that area. But also, it's a Black woman taking another Black woman's narrative, which is critical. Many of the Deep South narratives that were WPA are often taken by white interviewers and by former slaves who are living on the same plantations where they were enslaved, right? So the likelihood that they have very pointed discussions. And just to point back to this, many folks is quite different in the Virginia narrative, in that the Virginia narratives are taken by an all-Black team out of Hampton Institute or Hampton University. So that helps to explain probably why folks is more forthcoming about this, her understanding of what was going on. So Brooks recalls in the narrative being enslaved in Virginia, like doesn't recall exactly where, but sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana at about 14 or 15 years old. She's totally socially isolated. First of all, she's stripped from her mother and her siblings and her grandmother. She's sold to this Louisiana plantation where they speak Creole French. She has no idea what anyone's saying for a couple of years. She doesn't know what her master's saying. As you might imagine, that's not a good situation to be in if you're an enslaved person. To not know what your master is commanding is not exactly the best situation to be in. The other enslaved folks around her don't speak English. They also practice Catholicism. She's like, I don't know what they were talking about with that either. So she's like totally socially isolated. But about 4 years into her enslavement in this context in southeast Louisiana, she catches wind through the grapevine, which is another important feature of alternative Black spatial practices in this context. She catches wind through the grapevine that another enslaved woman has been sold to the adjoining sugar plantation. And she says, like, as soon as I was done with work for the day, I ran to go see this woman. I ran the whole way to see, number one, if we were related and if I knew her, and number two, if she knew my mother. And given what I've said about this connection or disconnection, active plundering of those relationships between enslaved folks' children and their mothers, I think that underscores why that's significant. They realize they don't know each other at all. They're not from the same county. They don't know the same people. She doesn't know her mother. But what they do realize is that they share the same kind of hush arbor connection. They know the same prayers from these Virginia hush arbors. They know the same songs from these Virginia hush arbors. And so they create a whole new world that ends up attracting other enslaved folks to this insurgent kind of community. And she notes a number of times where they get caught or where they get punished for this violently for this enactment. And again, it's critical to understand that enslaved folks in this context are praying for their liberation, right? And which masters understand and why they're regulating Black life in this way, even though it is under the guise of the same kind of religious orthodoxy. They're like, nah, we don't want that over here because we know that these people will be planning a rebellion. Nat Turner, of course, made that really clear, right? A Christian pastor, traveling pastor who's like, God told me that we should annihilate the plantation owners, right? So in this next portion, I want to talk about so I've talked about the kind of displacement of the plot into the Deep South. I want to now think about how it's partially disrupted, of course, by the Civil War, but then also how it continues to animate these small-scale visions of collectivity around alternative land use, around marginal ecological zones that Black communities create and use, how they're translated in the post-emancipation world to create an infrastructure and an architecture of Black life that when we get to the Jim Crow enclosures by the 1900s, early 20th century, are displaced and help to animate the kind of social worlds that Black communities create in the context of Philadelphia and other cities. So of course, Du Bois in his 1935 Black Reconstruction notes how former slaves faced, quote, murder, force, and anarchy across the war zone, of course, but also in what are called contraband camps, right, where the large numbers of enslaved folks run behind Union lines and where they continue to face overwork, starvation, disease, sexual violence, et cetera. And yet, despite this kind of near, and especially in Virginia and Louisiana, which are the two places I've been talking about, these are total war landscapes, right? Virginia is nearly, all those plantations are burned, right? A lot of them are, right? A lot of the Mississippi is, and those plantations are also burned and destroyed because of the critical strategic importance of the Mississippi River Valley, right? And yet in the post-emancipation world, Black communities continue to use these small-scale practices of land and water cultivation that emphasize intracommunal and collective small-scale forms of autonomy and well-being to animate post-emancipation life and to create whole infrastructures of Black living in this context. So these are oyster plat records that I want to just share with you. And these are from the 1890s in Virginia of course, Virginia is the richest ex-Confederate state, which still places it well behind the richest Union state. Of course, most of Virginia's capital, like most of the Confederate states' capital, is bound with slavery. And so at the end of the Civil War, when there are no more slaves, there's no more capital, and there's a large amount of debt. So Virginia, in this context, seeks to basically to codify oyster fisheries in this context to help generate a state revenue and to help pay the war debt. And so I want to note a couple of things before I move into Black practices with these kinds of worlds. I see this also as a kind of repressive archive, actually, because there are probably lots of people who are working the water prior to it being codified and licensed and all of that and requiring fees. So it also just represents the reality that that probably the state record itself actually shows Black folks being displaced and dislodged from these practices. I also want to note that these were never just natural or given beds. The Rappahannock, as their own more recent archaeological work illustrates, they worked these beds from time immemorial, and they cultivate. So these were cultivated. So what settlers viewed as just a given resource there for extraction and taxability are actually had been long cultivated waterscapes. And so, for example, the Rappahannocks, who the river is named after and all of that, and who this is their ancestral territory, you know, at their own self-directed archaeology shows that, for example, they never took the largest or the smallest oysters. They didn't rake oysters, so they dove for them and you can only dive about 25 feet. So and they never overfished these oyster grounds. It's scary to me. This is quite scary to me. But apparently, Virginia oysters can grow up to a foot long. I'm not getting in that water with a foot long oyster. I don't know about y'all. I just imagine it'll bite my foot off, even though oysters have no teeth. So in this context, of the post-emancipation world, Virginia seeks to basically use the symbolic power of the old planter class to underwrite a new round of enclosures and ecocidal enclosures in this context by transposing the old landed relations and forms of domination onto the waterway. So what I mean by that is most of the oyster houses that consolidate by the early 20th century are actually owned by the steamboat companies. The steamboat companies are actually owned by Northern Railroad companies. And so even with this kind of outside infusion of capital, the state, what they understand as the apex of this hierarchy of labor that's emerging and that they understand as the best means of extracting a taxable income from these waterways is the planter. So even though it's a whole new economic structure that's being derived through Northern capital, it is in fact the use of this idea of the hierarchy of labor in this context onto the waterway that the state is centralizing. And that leads in the 19th century and into the 20th century to the massive extraction of oysters and to pretty much their decimation in this context, that vision. And so I want to contrast that, and especially the kinds of hundreds of acres that white oystermen who are considered planters, in scare quotes, begin to cultivate in this period. The small-scale ways that Black communities continue to work the water and how that connects to their visions of social worlds and a whole sort of alternative geography. And riffing off Clyde Woods, I would say a kind of alternative development scheme that we could derive out of this. So here we have a plat from Lawrence Fauntleroy, who began in the late 19th century, early 20th century to rent a half an acre of river bottom from the state. And along with the census records, it's clear that the Fauntleroys are combining a kind of agricultural and aquacultural production. Of course, oystering is fall and winter cultivation practice, and farming primarily is a summertime thing. So we can see that they're engaged in a kind of bifurcated praxis along family lines in order to create a kind of stability. The Fauntleroys, in addition to renting this half of acre of river bottom for oyster cultivation, they own about 20 acres of land, 10 of which they cultivate, 5 of which they maintain as a meadow or as an orchard, according to the census, and 5 of which they maintain as forest or wooded land. The Tunstals are similar, another family in this context, all in Essex County, my home county. The Tunstals also own about 20 acres of land, rent as a collective about 4 acres of oyster ground, river bottom. And also, critically, the Tunstals also, who are oyster workers, also live directly next to their siblings. And so when you start to see these kind of patchwork, small-scale cultivation practices, Black communities are actually creating a kind of collective space that they work collectively, right? It's critical because these modes are used to build a whole Black infrastructure. So for example, here we have a newspaper associated with the first Black high school in this region called the Gloucester Letter, and the school was called the Gloucester High School. Again, the first Black high school. Virginia doesn't allocate resources for Black secondary education until the 1940s, so Black communities have to educate themselves if they want to go beyond a kind of very basic primary school. And in this particular snippet that I've given you is a kind of negative example, but helps to highlight the ways that these small-scale cultivation practices are actually being used to generate a Black world. When the editor and the first principal of the Gloucester High School notes that after the 1889 emancipation celebration, where thousands of people gathered at Gloucester Courthouse, like basically they created a fundraising drive in that period to try to raise the funds to build the building for this high school. He notes that they didn't get as much money at this 1889 celebration that they had anticipated getting for the building fund, and it's because oysters are bad that season, right? So we get the inverse of that is like, in a good season, oysters are literally being used to fund these schools, and these schools are small local rural schools, but they're networked, especially through church and other congregations, they're networked up through post-secondary education institutions, including seminaries in the state of Virginia, Black seminaries. These schools have a whole network and life even after they close, with evidence in the Baltimore Afro-American and the Philadelphia Tribune and other Black newspapers in the North that continue to have alumni association meetings into the mid-20th century and later 20th century. So they're an active part of Black worlds that extend beyond these rural communities. And so it's critical to understand that this is all before Jim Crow in Virginia is consolidated. The first Jim Crow laws in Virginia aren't passed until the 20th century. So there's this window between 1865 and 1900 where Black communities, it's not a free-for-all. Like, Black communities aren't just doing whatever they want. There's a lot of violence and repression, but they are able to start building a world, and that's part of what Jim Crow emerges to kind of regulate and to remove from this geography. And so I wanted to just note, as I move into thinking about post-emancipation or into the Great Migrations, I want to note the ways that the Jim Crow order was also a round of enclosure, a privatization of land and waterscapes, as much as it was also a kind of arcane or weird, social regulation of what Black people could do in day-to-day life. Carter G. Woodson, in his 1930 publication book, The Rural Negro, notes about the 20s in the rural South, how Black people were increasingly, quote, turned away from the bathing beach, which was once a free-for-all swimming place, not admitted to the private game reserve, which occupied the old fishing and hunting grounds, and prohibited from having any parties on the Placid Lake where they once rowed their canoes without fear of disturbance. And of course, in my own home community, there's a lynching in the same oystering communities I've been talking about of Thomas Washington in this period, as well as the kind of broader terror of sexual violence, murders, chain gangs, and other means of attempting to recapture Black life. So when we talk about the Great Migrations, it's important to understand that that the Great Migrations aren't just about better jobs in industrial epicenters in the North. They're also about the fact that this small-scale cultivation practices that began to create a world are being, that Black people are being forcibly removed from that. In addition to, of course, the violence, also the 1920 permanent collapse in agricultural prices also drives many Black communities off the land. And of course, in Virginia and in the U.S. in general, the 1920 is the peak of Black land ownership. It's in this this sets the ground for the bulk of the book, and I'll just very quickly talk about the kind of ways that these imaginaries of land and autonomy continue to underwrite Black social existence in the context of urbanized Black communities in the industrial metropolis. And so, of course, and in the book, Dark Agoras, the formation, of course, an agora is associated in the classical Greek sense with the space for the citizen, especially markets that are associated with the citizenry, and as opposed to women and as opposed to slaves. And so dark kind of qualifies it for me. I'm interested in these worlds that shadow the kind of dominant formations of the citizen in the context of Philadelphia. And for me, I take under the rubric of Dark Agoras, or the umbrella of Dark Agoras, two very different kinds of social worlds associated with working class Black life and migrant communities. Number one, the so-called underground, the economic and social underground, as well as the kind of set apart, these religious communities. And just to give you a sense, Philadelphia Negro, Du Bois's 1899 sociological work, and really the only sociological work in the 19th century, early 20th century in the U.S. context, because the other sociologists weren't real sociologists. That's another discussion. He describes the ways that basically, through the kind of wanderings, what he calls the wanderings from the countryside to larger towns, and then to Norfolk and Richmond, Virginia, and then to Washington, D.C., and then Baltimore and Philadelphia, how Black working class communities are, quote, sharpened and prepared for crime by the slums of many cities through which they have passed. So that's a marking of the underground. And on the other hand, he also notes these, what he calls little noisy missions, or churches, dozens of which emerged, quote, in various parts of Philadelphia, led by wandering preachers. And of course, for Du Bois, he thought that the demonstrative worship style and the physical interactions with the spirit in these contexts were survivals of old plantation customs that would, quote, are dying away, right? Of course, Du Bois gets a lot right. As someone who wrote for many, many years and across various contexts, he often gets lots of things right, but this one he did not get right because the storefront is still very much a part of Black urban geographic life. And of course, Du Bois's middle class and New England Black sensibility is quite dismissive of these formations. But I want to just very quickly talk about the kind of ethos that's forged in these worlds, and to think with you very briefly about how they create a kind of they co-create a kind of epistemic and practical understanding that riffs back on and references back to the kind of temporal ordering, the kind of worlds of the plot, and particularly the post-emancipation plot, the ways that had begun to underwrite Black liberatory possibilities. So I'm not going to read this to you all because it's quite explicit, but this is from Lucille Bogan, and I'm using this as just a kind of stand-in here for the underground here in the sense of kind of a sexual underground. Lucille Bogan is recorded this song in the 1930s. And what's interesting to me, of course, is that she embraces a kind of erotic sovereignty that we might consider a kind of, a kind of Black feminist ethos around sexual liberation very early in the context of those kinds of discussions. In the song, she embraces non-monogamous sex. She says, essentially, if you don't perform oral sex on me, I'm not performing it on you. All these kinds of very explicit lyrics. She notes a number of times throughout the song that she's in Baltimore, and of course we probably could not imagine a rural Black, a woman in a rural Black community singing this kind of song and not being abused or facing real violence, even intracommunally. And yet I'm fascinated by the fact that the refrain of the song and the title of the song is "Till the Cows Come Home." This continuing reference, a distilled, a transposed connection to those older landscapes and those other older worlds, but nevertheless one that continues to, in its temporal features, to underwrite her version and vision for what an autonomous life in the city looks like. And on the other side of the dark agoras with the set apart, I'm interested in here Mrs. W., a woman who's interviewed by the first black folklorist to receive a PhD, Arthur Huff Fawcett from Penn. In his 1944 Black Gods in the Metropolis, he interviewed lots of folks who were connected to what are considered cultish organizations, storefronts, and other kind of not respected black religious worlds. Mrs. W, in these archive notes, his ethnographic notes at Penn, talks about how she stepped out of her stoop, stepped out from her house, and she saw these men gambling, and suddenly that gives her a vision in which she's taken up by the Holy Spirit. She sees basically the slum crumble, and out from the slum there appears basically a wide open field. Again, I'm getting at here the kind of, not the one-to-one kind of relationship between how the plot is moved to the city, although there are instances in which black folks are derided for trying to keep chickens or you know, plant a garden or any of that, which was not in fad at that moment in the way that it is now. But still, this lingering referent point to this rural imaginary and this rural landscape orders their vision for an autonomous vision for their own lives in the urban context. And so again, I'm interested in the ways that these are translated and translocated, and the ways that these places, rural imaginaries, continue to inhabit these urban imaginaries about urban futures and about black life in relation to urban futurity. And of course, very quickly, and this is, I promise I'm not going on for too much longer because I'm well at time. But of course, this is a HOL, Home Ownership Loan Corporation, red line map of Philadelphia. And as you might imagine, black communities inhabit the red zones, right? They're placed in areas of the city and only allowed to access real estate, rental or purchase, but primarily rental in the sections of the city that the state understands as uninsurable, right? And so we understand the ways that Jim Crow sticks to black flesh even when black folks migrate, and the way that they continue to live in this kind of context through racial segregation and economic violence. And in the larger book, I think about the ways that that in the interwar period and up through Black Power, the ways that this kind of ethos continues to shape black social organizations and organizational life. In this chapter, in the chapter I'm referring to here, with this use of the communion table, referring to Father Divine's Peace Mission movement, a large interwar mass following that by the 1930s, Father Divine, by many of his followers, is considered a second coming. So I'm interested, outside of his kind of charismatic power, the bottom-up formation, particularly led by black women who actually underwrite his power, and that he in turn sort of colonizes as a kind of charismatic figure, because I don't care what he say, his words were not as compelling as these large, humongous feasts that people, that particularly women are engaged in creating. The people in the 30s and 40s are going there because they're hungry, not to hear him get up there and talk about how he's going to heal you, you know. But he's in a part of his charismatic power is an astute replay of black imaginaries, plotting imaginaries, and the Black Commons imaginaries. For example, on a number of his the newspapers for the organization, he's pictured riding a horse. So if you know the kind of context of black communities really before the Civil War being violently excluded from horse riding, you know what power he's figuring and demonstrating. He's riffing off these older forms of a liberatory imagination. He's also pictured a number of times at their rural land project in Ulster County in upstate New York, where they own lots of acreage. The next chapter goes into the 1964 Philadelphia, North Philadelphia or Columbia Street riot, and this area is now renamed Cecil B. Moore, if you're familiar with North Philly, but at this time was called Columbia Avenue. when they attempt to violently arrest a black woman, Odessa Bradford, in 1964 in August. She fights back. When she fights back, the police intensify their violence. People start gathering. This is the highest concentration in Philadelphia of bars in this period. It's a black neighborhood, and that's part of how segregation operates in Philadelphia, is to concentrate so-called vice into black communities. It's also considered the center of the black underground in the city. When she's arrested, when they finally are able to arrest her, so-called religious dissidents began spreading a rumor, according to police and the FBI, around North Philly that a pregnant black woman had been shot and murdered by the police. Of course, that's not verifiably true, but it does not matter. But after a certain point, the riot is in full swing. And I read arrest records and other records against their grain as repressive records to think about the kind of articulation of a black commons, and also to think about the kind of black geographies that precede and are only indexed in the police record. So, for example, just very quickly, when the crowds begin to amass around the site where she's arrested, youth go to the rooftops in the surrounding neighborhood and start throwing glass bottles at the police and at their cars. And of course, of course, they didn't just run up there with bottles at that moment. What you get there is a sense that black communities who live in basically unlivable geographies of segregation, who live in subdivided, and subdivided again, row houses on top of each other, often that fall in this period, or that burn down and kill lots of black people in this period, that they're using rooftops as a space of black social existence. And of course, that's not visible from the bird's eye view of the planner, or even the helicopters that they deploy in one of the first deployments of helicopters in an urban unrest. And it's not visible from the beat patrolman or social worker vantage either. So there continues to be this kind of black world and geographic making that exceeds the kind of rubrics of segregated life in the context of Philly. And I end the book substantively with thinking about the rise of MOVE in 1972, and they're notoriously, infamously bombed by the city of Philadelphia's police department in 1985 under its first black mayor, Wilson Goode. In the book, I don't really address the bombing. I really think about their formation. Again, many of them coming from the underground into this kind of set-apart world. Again, I also challenge the charisma associated with John Lepard, aka John Africa, their leader, by thinking about, engaging their narratives, and for many of them, is their relationships with each other, not with the kind of charismatic figure that draws them and keeps them in this world. And finally, I end the book with thinking about the massive transformation through real estate investment trusts and massive gentrification in Philadelphia that have all but displaced these worlds and also taken them up in many ways. So what I mean by that is for example, one of the hotels that the Father Divine's Peace Mission movement, that they rehabilitate and create as an integrated space in the 1930s and 40s, the Divine Lorraine Hotel, it has this first life as a segregated, white, exclusive, wealthy space. It has a second life under the Divine and them spiritual appropriation, where anybody can come into that space as long as they adhere to some of their rules. Then it goes into disrepair. There's a vision for it in the early 2000s from a design contest where someone wants to make it a site of collective mourning and a crematorium, which also gives you a lot of sense about what Philadelphia had going on in the 1980s through the early 2000s. And then now it's a luxury property that is back to its original exclusive, high-end real estate market formation. And so I end the book with thinking about how many of these worlds have been dissolved and how many of them are the black underground in particular, but also the set apart, continue to have this ongoing tension with visions for the city as a site of extraction, disposability, and violence, anti-black violence. I'll end there. Thank you so much.
That's loud. So we definitely have some time for questions, and while you all think a little bit about what you want to ask, I'll ask what I want to ask, because I have the microphone. No, JT, I keep thinking like about your own history and growing up in rural Virginia, less rural Virginia, then to the city, and then back into the city, and then back in Virginia. And you keep going back and forth between these rural and urban worlds. Like, is this a search also to make your own life make sense?
Yes, that's very tied to my own life and also my family's world making and life worlds. So part of how I even come to Philadelphia, often I get the question is, Saidiya Hartman has changed the game a little bit in relation to right at Philly, but most people who are not from Philly don't want to know that much about Philly history. It's not New York in the same way that it bears this whole, or Chicago in the ways that, or LA, or Philly is, considered a more regional city. So my turn to it actually stems from my own family's history. My grandmother, Elsie, went to South Jersey and lived in Philly in the 50s and 60s as a farm worker, cutting asparagus, had a child in Philly that she couldn't take back because she was very young when she had her, couldn't take her back to Virginia, left her there with extended family. My aunt has these stories about, unbeknownst to her adopted mother, her adopted father knew my grandmother and my grandmother's family and would actually sneak and take her back to visit her family till she was about 13, when they continued to go to the neighboring county where they were from in Virginia. But we didn't reconnect with them until the 1980s. And even how we reconnected was all about how Black communities continue to forge these, what had been rural relations in urban contexts. So my aunt found my grandmother when essentially a man with the last name she knew that her mother had, Roane, my last name, lived on her block, was about to retire and move back to the South. One of her girlfriends dragged her to this man's house. It was like, you have to go talk to him and at least find out whether or not he knows your mother. And my aunt was like, nah, that's probably unlikely. She finally convinces her on like the last day that he's there, and realizes actually that it's my grandmother's second cousin. In this period of up through the massive gentrification of Philly, so many West Philly, especially in Southwest Philly, and to some degree North Philly, although there had been more turnover, particularly related to the riot. Many of her whole block was Virginia, right? I mean, most of those people settled in around each other. And so I think it's both my own going back and forth, but it's also this familial going back and forth that really underwrites this work. And then it takes on as archives do, it takes on its own life when you start going into the archives. These kind of weird social worlds that also exist become a central part of the work, primarily because of my own curiosity in the archive. But yeah, so it's very much bound with my own identity of going back and forth, and understanding that I view landscapes and approach geography as someone who was born in a rural community. And even when it's urban geography, that's how, it's a different vantage. And so thank you for that.
Other questions? I'll come to you. Get my steps in.
I think you can hear better without that stuff that muffles it.
But he can't.
Okay. I recently watched a documentary on CNN, which was having to do with a recent research project of someone traveling through the South, interviewing people about their attitudes on studies of race being introduced into the educational system. And they were talking to whites and blacks and whatever. And I was struck by when they were talking to, say, a class of Black high school students, very few of them knew anything at all, or very little, about the past, about slavery. And they showed very little interest in learning about it. And I was wondering, how could this be? And part of it, I think, was because they really didn't want to focus on that. They want to think about the present and the future. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, about why the study of slavery is not something welcomed by the Black community.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just even thinking about back to my own high school education, literally the only two data points in Black history that I can recall in the state that always had one of the largest Black populations from the colonial period into the 20th century. Virginia was the largest Black population in the country. The only two data points that I learned in that were slavery and actually Booker T. Washington, Booker T. Washington, and then civil rights. And the way that civil rights and slavery and Booker T. Washington were taught in Virginia, in rural Virginia at that time anyway, was totally repressive. It was not a narrative it wasn't even a narrative of slavery to freedom, like a kind of even simplified version of that. It was literally like you only show up in these two realms. So I think it's quite, it could be quite disparaging and dehumanizing and inflict further trauma actually to only understand yourself as an enslaved person. And when I say that, I also mean that folks, we didn't learn about, they skipped over the units of African history, right? So we didn't learn that we had any history prior to slavery. We learned that we were slaves. And then we learned about Booker T. Washington, which is a complicated figure in relation to his politics and also to his at least public embrace and the way that it was taught. It wasn't taught in those complicated ways. His behind-the-scenes work wasn't exposed. We just thought this person said segregation was okay, right? So I think that's part of it. The way that it's structured into curriculum is often disempowering. It is not liberatory to just understand that you come from slaves and that's it. So I think that might help explain it. And I think, I think that I'll stop there, but I think that is probably very much a part of it. Most Southern state curriculums do not actually teach Black history outside of those very limited parameters. So I think that's part of it. Thank you.
Other questions? Dorothea.
Yes, I have a question, and forgive me if you've already addressed this before my arrival. I'm curious about the book cover. I'm loving the art, and I would like to know a little bit more about it. Where did it originate from, and why?
Thank you for that. The artist is a Philadelphia-based Black artist named Mikhail Elam. And my partner had encountered him through just being an artist, and in that context, he works at an art store in Philadelphia. And so it's a small Black artist world. I mean, there's a substantial number of Black artists in Philly, but especially even 10 years ago, it's a small world. So they had encountered each other. And my press really wanted me to have a historical, very specific, related to the work archival type of image. And I pushed back against that. Much of the work is actually about opacity, around obscurity, around the fact that Black social existence is not straightforward or transparent, that in plain sight often, in addition to subterranean worlds that are actually hidden from view totally, that even sometimes in the context of segregation and slavery, when Black communities are outward with a public kind of collectivity, the folks who are not in that world literally don't know what's going on. They don't understand linguistically and otherwise. So I wanted an image that represented that better. The fact that there are figures that we know it's about people, that these are Black figures, but that we can't necessarily derive their full integrity in a certain kind of way through his artistic license with the figure here. And I think, that's primarily why I chose this. And of course, it's a fight with the press because, you have this relationship with your acquisitions editor, and they read your work, hopefully, they read your work. You start building a rapport with them around the work, and then you get on production side, and it goes to the marketing people. Number one, they ain't gonna never read your book. They're just history sells in this way, so this is what we're gonna do. So it was a little fight, but luckily my acquisitions person backed me up to say, no, do what he wants. So it worked out in that way. Thank you for that.
Other questions?
Oh, a hush arbor is the kind of formation of a church or other kind of congregation in the woods, right? An unsanctioned gathering of black communities, normally associated with the context of slavery, and really understood as a subversion in that context, and hushed literally because you have to dampen the sound through, whether it's through the overturned pot or wet blankets around the trees that help to dampen sound. Because these are, in Virginia in the colonial period, they passed laws against any two black people caught together and they don't have a sanction for that, as in in a written document, or there's no white overseer there. It's punishable up to death, right? So black communities who create these worlds out in the woods where they're praying for where they're subverting Christian theology to say God is liberatory, they have to be quiet about it. So that's what a hush arbor is. One of the best accounts is a fictional account. So if you've ever read Beloved, the part before Sether is they attempt to recapture Sether in Toni Morrison's Beloved, and before she is pushed to this kind of really terrible relationship where she attempts to kill her children in order to prevent them from being taken back to the plantation, Sweet Home. There's a scene in there where her name just slipped me, but one of the other primary characters in that work says in this clearing, actually they're in a free place, but they continue this practice in Ohio for this fleeting moment of like 20 days or something that Sether is free before the slave catchers come, where she says like, love your hands. Outside of this space, they don't love your hands. And Morrison does such a good job about reanimating this world fictionally. She talks about how like the laughing and crying in this space blend together in a way that makes it difficult to really parse out what's going on. So I think if you're interested in, their accounts of these kind of spaces are replete in slave narratives, but they're also very pointedly and vividly described in Toni Morrison's Beloved, if you're interested in what that feels like and what that looks like. So yeah, hopefully that answers.
Any final questions as we wrap up?
Teddy, thank you. Wonderful, the connection from slavery through to the 20th century. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about Khalil Gibran Muhammad's condemnation of blackness, Kelly Grove's Colored Amazon, and even Saidiya Hartman's work centers on Philly. I wonder if you could explain a little bit, how does your work fit within the historical context and some of the things that these other scholars have tried to done? How do you situate your work within that tradition?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And when I said flippantly earlier that not many people do Philly, I didn't mean to obscure the fact that there is a rich historiography of civil rights and black power and earlier stuff, as you're pointing to, in 19th century and early 20th century stuff about Philadelphia. So I think part of what the work does, I particularly engage historiographically with the kind of long movement framework. So in relation to the kind of historiography of black life, and in relation to, in particular, Philadelphia, there's a great history in the long movement frame. Long movement being this kind of historiographical turn after a certain point to see the extended civil rights and black power, black liberation struggle as not just confined to the short period of civil rights in the kind of classical civil rights paradigm of Montgomery, depending on how you frame it to voting rights and civil rights. To that, even within that capacious framework, most of the groups that I follow in this work fall at the edges of that historiography. So Matthew Countryman's Up South, which is a great book and a very detailed and thorough civil rights into black power history of Philadelphia, points to, for example, MOVE. They show up at the end of the book, even though they're founded in '72 and contemporaries of lots of black power organizations, and many of them are former Panthers. They show up in the book just when they're bombed out. They show up as Wilson Good's victims. Father Divine and them show up in the historiography of the long civil rights or long Black power or long Black liberation struggle historiography as crazy or out there, not in the realm of the sane, and so they're discarded. And then what that gets me to is the point that many of these, I think what I try to do is think about the ways that these underground worlds also touch on underground and set apart worlds, touch on that on the long movement frame, even though they're marginalized or totally excluded from accountants of those worlds. And I think that makes a difference. So, for example, in the '64 riot, Cecil B. Moore is, as I mentioned, Columbia Avenue is renamed after Cecil B. Moore. Cecil B. Moore is the NAACP local chapter president in Philadelphia. When he goes out, the woman who they violently arrest, Odessa Bradford, he sees himself as an interlocutor who can, unlike the kind of static, old school clergy Black leadership in Philadelphia that had led, quote unquote, led up to that point, sees himself as being in touch with everyday working class Black people. And yet when he convinces the city of Philadelphia as an interlocutor to essentially free Odessa Bradford, they go out with a microphone and pronounce that she's free. I mean, she's alive. She can't be dead. This rumor is a lie. And people throw stuff at him. And I want to know what that relationship is to these worlds. And I think, again, what I get at a lot in this book is the ways that even his kind of charismatic authority and power as interlocutor, as Father Divine's as interlocutor, John Africa Lesser's interlocutor, but how those are forms of power and the charismatic form of power that they follow actually are preceded by these other kinds of preceded by these other forms of labor, the redeployment of reproductive labor, and the kind of insurgent work that happens at ensuring that everybody's eating, that everybody has a place to stay, and all of that, are then taken up by charismatic leaders to reinforce their power or to create their power. And again, as Countryman points out, for example, in Up South, Cecil Moore does effectively use the riot as leverage to gain more access for a certain vein of integration in the city. And yet it's still, there is a real tension there between bottom-up visions of what that power meant and what his vision of that power meant. And I think I do, because of the way that I move through the book so quickly, I don't probably spend enough time on the 1880s and 1890s in Philadelphia proper. So some of the kind of condemnation of Blackness, that timeline, as well as Color Amazons and other works about Philadelphia. Cheryl Hicks' new book that she's working on about this same period. I'm hoping we'll fill in some of that a little more that those works do. In the interest of getting to Black power, I probably give them I probably don't do enough justice to that period. I'll stop because I could go on. We could have this historiographical discussion for days. But I appreciate that really generative question. Thank you.
I want to, Matthew got one to close us out, and then we are at time.
Thank you. I want to go back sort of to your opening film, because I've been thinking, as you've been talking, we were talking earlier, about the way in which slaves are using the sort of the liminal spaces on plantations, which aren't dedicated to monoculture, that are still wooded, to escape, to congregate. But then in modern culture, and pop culture in particular, I'm thinking some Hollywood films, the woods become, the presence of African Americans in woods becomes different. And from what I can think of, seems to be tied to women who have supernatural powers or mystical powers, that they're there in the woods. And the rest of that, of the role of the woods as a site of African American community is eclipsed. And I'm just wondering if this is a correct interpretation, or am I making it out of thin air, or?
No, I think part of it is a diagnosis, which you're pointing to in terms of the distillations in popular culture around Black communities in relation to, like, for lack of better terms, what we might consider natural landscapes, are vexed in part because of the Jim Crow displacements. I mean, I think as the Woodson slide points out, Black communities have this intimate relationship with waterscapes and landscapes that last into the 1920s that they're then extracted from. So I want to just go very quickly to this map just to give you a kind of sense of what I mean by this. Just very quickly, this is, my home community has 40 miles of riverfront land. The river out of Old English common law into the riparian doctrine in the 19th century in the U.S. context, tidal rivers are all commons. And yet, only about 40 feet, literally, of that 40 miles is currently accessible because of private land ownership. So in order to actually get to the water, you can't get to the water if you can't get past someone's private property, which in Virginia means Black people trespass it all, rich white people's land is not gonna be a thing. And there's another version of this talk where I show some of the signage that's Virginianese for modern Jim Crow, where it's like, don't do the, at the two little spaces that they do have open, they're like, don't do all these things, and let's white at least do whatever they want in Virginia on the water and the land and whatever else. So it's Virginianese for no Black people, right? Don't come over here and do anything. I think also I just want to point out that as Kevin Dawson's work points to, his Undercurrents of Power book points to, Black communities have to be radically alienated from, particularly from waterscapes. In the colonial period, they're the only people that can swim. Europeans don't swim in the colonial period. They're actually afraid of water, even sometimes for bathing. So it's like there's a real, and he argues pointedly, and this is potentially up for debate, but also that it's the African dugout canoe that colonists take up as they begin to colonize the Americas. Is not actually, they don't actually use indigenous forms of the dugout. They actually graft African forms of the dugout and rely on their labor. Black folks around the Americas and the diaspora are clam divers, pearl workers, they fish, they do all these kinds of things. So, I mean, the kind of trope that Black people don't touch pools or swim and all of that is actually a long alienation process from waterways, and I think it's and landscapes as well. And I think intimacies with forests are ubiquitous in slave narratives, and up through the Jim Crow era. So I think I think probably that popular cultural reference is part of actually the kind of softer hegemonic alienation or disarticulation of Black relationships to these places and to these ecological areas. And then I think, again, Black folks go to urban contexts and are totally isolated and removed from any kind of landed relation or grounded relationship with water. And so I think that's probably what those popular cultural references are reimagining this older tradition quite outside of the reality that Black communities' only kind of windows of freedom and possibility are actually in the woods and in the rivers, in the swamp and all of that. Thank you for that question.
Please join me in thanking JT.